and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Today, we will be talking about why Germany has rejected U.S. demand for ground troops in Syria. Then we will move a little south and take a look at the latest developments in Libya. And also a little later in the show, in Doha, the intra-Afghan peace talks between the Taliban and Afghan high-profile representatives of the government have come to an end. What can we conclude from this joint resolution, and where are the Taliban headed? But first off, let's talk about Syria. For that, I'd like to introduce our guests who are joining us right now from Bristol, Mr. Aaron David Miller. So, Mr. David, what, in your opinion, is the reason behind why Germany would not increase its military presence in Syria?
Well, I think what we see here is a geopolitical game where the move towards having perpetual war is under some kind of threat. I mean, recently the Trump administration has pulled back from attacking Iran, which is a very good thing, and that the Germans are not sending more troops to Syria also speaks of a Western uncertainty about whether ever-increasing involvement, military involvement in the Middle East is a good thing. I mean, I think we can see that the Syrian conflict, perhaps it would have started without Western intervention, but certainly there was Western intervention from very, very early on, which has meant that this conflict has gone on for much longer than it would otherwise have done, and cost many more lives than would have been the case.
Right. And the U.S. Special Representative on Syria, James Jeffrey, he said he was waiting for an answer by the end of the month. And at the same time, there has been a popular sort of opinion in the Western circles in Washington, D.C., that the military solution is not the solution for Syria right now. It needs to be a political one. But here we see Trump administration trying to get out of Syria when it is right now in the midst of utter chaos. So we also see the German political parties not seeming to be very eager to join this sort of situation in Syria. They don't want to extend their presence there. If you were to reflect back on the geopolitical situation at the moment, when it comes to Iran, it comes to Syria, it comes to what is even happening in Libya, do you feel like Europe is maybe taking a different stance as it did previously when it was more aligned, more in cohesion with the U.S. strategy?
Well, that's something which changes historically, doesn't it? If we think back, way back to 2003 with the invasion of Iraq, remember the French weren't involved in that. They wanted to have a different line. Of course, the British government were very much involved. And it's also been the case that it's been the British who've pushed for action against Iran when it looked like Obama, as president, was going to take tough enough action on Iran. The British tried to find a way to push him into action. And so we do have not a European versus US thing, but a division between those governments in the West who have a more realist approach to this, and those who have a more ideological approach who want to attack what they see as the Shia Crescent, who in that process have allied themselves with militant Sunni nationalism, or with some aspects of militant Sunni nationalism, and that strategy is a strategy which is supported by the Israelis, but that strategy seems to be coming off the rails a little bit now, with Trump pulling back from Iran and indeed from Syria. And that's a very good thing. It looks like we may, as a result of some of the processes underlying this, we may have averted war with Iran, which can only be a good thing for world peace.
It can definitely only be a good thing, but also it brings into question what President Trump had been saying in the past few months, that we've pretty much eliminated ISIS from Syria. We've got hold of them, every last one of them. And here he's demanding for more from his NATO allies. And it's not just that. He wants to replace the U.S. soldiers with other fighters from other countries. What does this reflect to you, essentially? Is the war hit a point where no more can be gained from this, can benefit anybody? Everybody wants to get out?
I think so. I mean, let's remember, of course, that the U.S. campaign was not just against ISIS. It was also against the Assad government, a government which you can criticize for many things, but which is the legitimate government of Syria. That's what's key here, is that they haven't been able to defeat the Syrian government, and they're now trying to find a way to get round that process. They've been united, along with the Saudis, their allies, in trying to undermine and topple the Syrian government. It's part of a strategy which would have then tried to move on to Iran, but that's a strategy which has failed, and we see them Trump trying to internationalize military involvement there, and that's not a strategy that works either. So Trump is in a difficult position because he's as the UK ambassador reportedly said in his emails, he is tremendously inept, but he is also not a signed-up neoconservative in the way that many of the people previously advising US presidents were, and so he's in a difficult position. His instinct is to make deals because he's a businessman, and that's different from the kind of ideological approach which many of his advisors would favour, and some of the previous US presidents would favour.
Right, and it's also being said by analysts across the board here, the US strategy right now, whether it's in Syria, and especially considering we're talking about Syria here, or in other places, to withdraw right now, even when they talk about Afghanistan, is that it shows that US is weakening its posture. It doesn't stand behind what it supports, the ideology of a democratic system, of taking care of its interest in the region and wanting peace. I mean, is that something that resonates with you, that you agree with?
No, the US doesn't want peace. It doesn't want democracy. It wants to project power. That's why they have allied themselves with militant Sunni Islam in Syria, supporting the Al-Qaeda franchise there, and Jaish al-Islam and several others. It's never been interested in peace and democracy. It may claim to be interested in such things, but it's interested in projecting its own power. And of course, the UK government has almost always been had its back in that respect, and in fact has tried to push it further towards more hawkish positions, whereas other governments like the French and the Germans have on occasion been able to exert some kind of sanity in foreign policy thinking, even if they are themselves strongly involved. And in this particular case, in Syria, the French are very strongly involved with the UK and the US in trying to crush the Assad regime, which has failed. And they've been trying to do that by a whole range of mechanisms, by funding the opposition to Assad and by a huge propaganda campaign.
Absolutely. And then we see on the same argument, then they're in terms of trying to show their power, their dominance in the region, their biggest issue right now, and always has been when it comes to Syria, was not really protecting the Syrians from alleged chemical attacks by Assad. They were really because Assad's ally was Russia. Yes, I mean,
the alleged chemical attacks, of course, are, as you said, alleged.
No, well, from alleged, I mean, the chemical attacks did take place, but who were they attributed to? Because there's such a big controversy over whether they were airdropped by in the US airstrikes, or was it Assad who dropped them?
No. The chemical attacks didn't take place. I mean, the Douma attack didn't take place. There was no chemical attack in Douma. There were two fluorine cylinders placed there by the opposition in alliance with Western forces, including British MI6.
Well, that's one version of it, isn't it? Because recently we also talked about this in our shows earlier, that it was a very controversial issue how the organization in charge of investigating the incident did not even attribute or take in account one of its investigators who said they were placed there. They didn't make any sense that they were airdropped.
That's right. Well, it wasn't only one of their investigators. It was the whole team who more or less came to that conclusion. But their views were systematically excluded from the final report by the OPCW, which has effectively been suborned or nobbled, as we would say in English, by the French, the UK, and the US. And indeed, the British put huge amounts of resources into fabricating chemical weapons attacks in Syria, attacks which simply didn't take place, which have been invented. Now, it's not that they've taken place and they were carried out by one or the other side. Most of them we've examined have been invented.
Right. So let me welcome here another guest who's joining us just right now, Istanbul, a political analyst, Mr. Can Hasasu. Welcome to Newswire. We're talking about a U.S. asking Germany to send more troops while it looks to withdraw from Syria. Is this conflict gone to a point where it is no longer feasible for the U.S. to be involved, whether it is to take on its own rival in the region, Russia, or for any other reason? Is it not supporting the Kurdish anymore, the opposition to Assad?
It's actually very confusing. I mean, the message that we are taking from the U.S. administrations within the last 4 to 5 months, actually in the last 1 year, is conflicting and confusing, actually. And we can't really estimate what's going to happen according to what happens today, because that's what happened months ago. I mean, the U.S. Declared that they are going to withdraw from Syria, and that decision changed and had some opposition from the Pentagon. So we can't be very sure about what the U.S. is going to do in the area so far, but the other part of the problem is continuing. Syria is still facing the same dilemma. Idlib province now under the same threat, and civilians are under the same threats. Nothing changed in their daily lives and in the risks that they are taking every day.
Well, what has changed is that the number of dead is going up through the roof. I mean, we have a recent report by the Syrian Network of Human Rights saying that just in the first half of 2019, we've seen almost 2,000 civilians dead. And the numerous, this includes media workers, this includes medical workers. Now, while this carnage takes place, irrespective of what Assad is saying, he's trying to deflect terrorist attacks or whatever the reasons he's giving, the point is that there's absolutely nothing coming from the world stage in terms of trying to bring to a halt on what's happening in Idlib and the rest of Syria. Why do you think that is?
Well, that's what I mean, actually. Nothing positively changing for the people of Syria and the civilians if we talk specifically about the problem. And that's because the very dynamic change that happens in the region. It's not only Syria, it involves Iraq. We could talk about Iraq at the same time, and many countries are involving in this problem. They look like they try to solve the problem, but most of the time countries like Iran, Syria, Russia, and America, and because of the relations between them, which is non-related to the region, could affect the path to the solution in the region. So we've always been talking about a proxy war in Syria, and it's not only a proxy war, but it's a proxy politics issue as well. I mean, it doesn't have to be a Syrian reason to change the path of what's happening here in the country. Problems between these countries could be reflected to the field here. And as you mentioned, in Idlib specifically, the bombardments are increasing and the life quality of the civilians are going worse day after day.
Mr. Miller, what's your take on the silence from the international community in terms of any kind of bilateral action, whether it's from the UNSC or someone else, some other powerful ally, who could take a sort of stance here and highlight that the number of people dying there on a daily basis continues to go unheeded by the way the Syrian regime is operating on the ground?
Well, I'm not sure that's true, is it? I mean, the example you just quoted is from the Syrian Network for Human Rights, which is an organization which is funded by, amongst other people, the British government, whose statistics have been called into question on many occasions. Are these civilians who are dying? When you look at the statistics of these, there are a large number, a disproportionate number of fighting-age men amongst the alleged civilian deaths. So we have to look at the question about the data which is coming out of that, and the question about who's responsible for that. These organisations that the Assad regime is fighting in Syria are organisations which our government in the UK would refer to as terrorists. It's not me that would regard them as terrorists. I think the word is too politically loaded. But both the UK government and the Syrian government, if they were in those countries, would regard these people as terrorists. But now the British government, because they're fighting Assad, says that they are somehow the moderate armed opposition. And this is plainly preposterous. What we need is an international negotiated settlement to the Syrian conflict, rather than suggesting that the problem is all the Syrian regime and the Russians killing civilians. Well, it's not clear that they're doing that.
Right. So what's your take on this, Mr. Hasasu? If the Germans, like they said, we're sending any more troops there, US is looking to withdraw, what does the end game look like right now for Syria?
As I said, it's not that clear. I mean, what's going to happen on field, and if some more German troops come to Syria, they are providing some technical support, and they don't have men on field so far. And the problem is not about the soldiers on the ground or how many people are fighting here. The problem is international community and major powers hasn't decided how to solve the problem. So I mean, the casualties are the civilians. We've been there. We've done stories from Syria, and it doesn't matter if the bomb falls on a small group of armed people and tens of civilians are dying around them. I mean, this is how the war is creating casualties. Maybe they're not targeted directly, but they are ignored. No one cares about the civilian casualties anymore. And I think their problem is the most important one, because these people, they are looking for safety. And whatever happens in Syria now came out of these security lag for civilians. Today's civilian, tomorrow could be a fighter because of this situation.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Hasasu and Mr. David, joining us for this conversation on what the next steps for the U.S. would possibly be in Syria. And with this, we're going to take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, the second story for today is why is the world reluctant to condemn Khalifa Haftar, a renegade general with a self-styled army, the Libyan National Army, who since January this year has been after replacing what he calls the corrupt, albeit UN-recognized government, the GNA. And he has overtaken most of Libya's rich oil fields in the south. So when the United Nations Security Council got together to condemn the deadly airstrike on a migrant center in Libya recently, that the UN blamed on Khalifa Haftar's forces, US pretty much stopped it. Had the resolution passed, it would have also called for a ceasefire and a return to political talks. In this attack, 120 people were killed in the airstrike on this migrant center, where guards were even accused of shooting fleeing migrants. Meanwhile, Putin blames the US for starting this mess in Libya. Haftar blames Turkey for meddling in his country for the sake of protecting his assets in the eastern Mediterranean. And all this and more we will be talking about in our discussion today. Let me introduce the guests who are joining us today. We have with us Mr. Resul Sardar. He's the Director of News and Programs at TR, joining us from Istanbul. And also with us is Dr. Issam Laroussi. He's a Professor of International Law, Senior Researcher, Fellow at Trends for Research and Advisory in Abu Dhabi. Welcome to both of you to Newswire. Mr. Resul, we'll start with you. Putin has been blaming the US for creating this mess in the first place, but Haftar recently was trying to take on Turkey, it seems. What do you make of these allegations being made by Haftar that Turkey is interested in protecting its interests?
Well, I think it is a kind of regional struggle between the pro-democratic forces and anti-democratic forces. Overall, this is the greater picture that I can see. Turkey is definitely supporting and recognizing the UN-recognized government based in Tripoli, and the international community also is recognizing that the only legitimate government of Libya. On the other hand, I think some of the powers in the region who are really afraid of the democratic the transitions in the region are trying to undermine all of the revolutions not to be successful examples for the democracy, because for the long term, it will undermine their own legitimacy. And it's not only about Libya. In Sudan, we see what's happening, and in Algeria as well, and in the other countries that went through the revolution, especially some have been very much worried about their own future, because in case of these revolutions to be successful, to lead to a successful governments, democratic governments, and the governments to go and come by fair and free elections for the long term, it will be a legitimacy problem. That's why they are supporting Khalifa Haftar. On the other hand, that is true. In the region, we should not be in dreams. If international community is acting to shut down or topple down a dictator in the region or in a country, they should have plan B. What's the next day plan? And as the former president of the USA, Obama, also admitted, when the NATO started the operation against Gaddafi, they did not have the next day plan. So it's something serious. You're invading a country and toppling down the government, whether you like it or not, which I personally believe that Gaddafi was a horrible dictator. But on the other hand, if you are toppling down a government, whether it's good or bad, you should have the next day planning, because you know that for that power vacancy, it's going to cost thousands of the lives. And this is exactly what we've seen here. In that sense, I think Russia has a point.
Russia has a point. But at the same time, when we see the UNSC trying to pass a resolution here that was initiated by the British and the US saying that, giving this excuse that, oh, we need to confer with Washington on this, pretty much stopping the resolution in its tracks. What does this reflect? Is this basically the US not willing to bring a stop to or a hurdle in the path of Haftar?
For the USA, I think there is a kind of de facto agreement between the USA and its allies. Allies are supporting Khalifa Haftar, and you know, in Girian, the last defeat of Khalifa Haftar, right, there has been loss of the USA's arms that have been captured. Those were the arms by the USA that sold, and these arms have been captured in Girian. So it is certainly very much clear that the USA also is supporting Khalifa Haftar. And besides that, Khalifa Haftar's rhetoric is very much interesting. From the day first on, he always has been claiming that he is fighting against Islamic extremism or Islamic terrorism, which is being very much bought and by the Western media industry and the political circles as well. So it's appealing the Western media, Western societies, and Western politicians.
Right.
So in any way, I think they have seen that in case of democratic transition for the long term, the conservative Democrats are going to come to power, and these conservative democracies or powers will be negotiating powers. It's going to be much tougher to manage them. And the USA, not to harm its relations with countries, I think they are trying to block any attempt to stop Khalifa Haftar, because Haftar is being supported by the...
Dr. Issam, let's bring you into this conversation. Whether it's a fight between democratic or anti-democratic forces, the problem really over here, Khalifa Haftar advancing towards Tripoli and continuing on his military carnage, and this recent incident of the migrant center being struck by airstrikes. Let's talk about the international spectrum of actors who are involved here. Doesn't that in itself, that the fact that there are regional players trying to protect their own interests, are the reason why Khalifa has gone this far?
Frankly, the Libyan cause is now in a real quagmire. We cannot believe in United Nations effort deployed just to make a balance in this disastrous country. Libya actually is in the brink of an all-out civil war that's threatening to end years of diplomatic effort to reconcile the two rival and political factions. It advanced the Khalifa Haftar from the east of the country. Also, has diplomatic scrambling and UN appealing in vain for trust. Actually, I think like Syria and Yemen, Libya is not helped by regional power rivalries, which mean we're talking about some devastated or different blocks that are not convened or not agreed to maintain the UN effort plan. Italy, meanwhile, Italy, France, and the UN have run often campaigning peace process, sometimes affecting also business and commercial interest. On other side, Russia is playing a spoiler role, and for the moment, the West aims to support the planned UN conference superficially, and one answer he has badly miscalculated. Now, actually, with the last year's tracks on the migrant center, it has been shown that this political problem in Libya have to deliver to I think to peaceful ways, and to make an ordinary Libya. I think it's not very expected in recent or in few months, because there is many factions there, many struggling warriors there, and also the problem Libya is suffering from that side. Right. Civilians has experienced more consequences of economic problem and very serious humanitarian problem.
Well, look, coming back to my original question here, which was essentially how the regional actors are playing a very big role. I mean, Khalifa Haftar's army here has 2/3 of Libya under its control. It's got the oil fields and is advancing continuously from towards Tripoli. So if we are going to talk about, Mr. Resul, how you mentioned that U.S. arms and ammunitions were found by the GNA in a recent sort of after having defeated Haftar from Ghazian. But the question really is, isn't Turkey also providing? The leadership has come out and said this openly, that we have been giving military and support to Libya, violating the very arms embargo that was placed there by the UN.
Well, Ayza, there's a fundamental difference. As Mr. Issam is the professor of international law, I also have a PhD on the international law, and specifically, particularly, my focus was based on the military interventions and the embargoes. So there is no problem with a country providing arms to a government that is recognized by the United Nations Security Council. So the National Assembly, based in Tripoli, is recognized by the United Nations Security Council as the legitimate government of Libya. Any country on the earth can have the armed deals with a United Nations recognized, a government that is recognized by the UN.
But there's an arms embargo. But there's an arms embargo there for a reason.
There are the restrictions in this case, not a kind of complete embargoes, because you know that Libya is not a producer when it comes to army. So the logic is that if this is a legitimate government of a country, and that country definitely to defend itself needs the arms. So if you leave a recognized legitimate government without any arm, how are they going to protect themselves? While on the other hand,
right. So, but Mr. Resul? Okay, let me ask you this then: what is Turkey's incentive for being there for the Libyan government?
The issue here is that, as I said, mainly what I can see is that Turkey and Qatar, as Mr. Issam Laroussi has just mentioned, supporting the Islamic forces. I think this is not an accusation that has the truth inside. It is not an Islamic force, it is the UN recognized force. And definitely Turkey, as a Mediterranean country, any of the crisis or turbulence or instability in the Mediterranean countries and in the Mediterranean Sea will affect Turkey's national security as well. And so in this case, that Turkey wants a powerful, a sovereign central government. I do not think that there is any problem with it, and that
so you're saying, Mr. Resul,
the benefit of the national interest.
So, Mr. Resul, you're basically saying that Turkey is looking out for its own national security by making sure that it's backing the UN-backed GNA there. But Dr. Issam, since we're running out of time, I only have a few minutes before we have to sign off here. What is your take on it? Do you agree that Turkey's interest is basically to protect itself because it is getting affected by what is happening in the region, or it might have anything to do with possibly a strategic sort of balance of power there, the presence of Greeks there on the shores of Libya?
Yes, I said because the situation there is very complicated and also divided between international and regional power, and also there is no control over the country. The power is divided among mainly coastal towns, tribes, and armed groups, some with Islamist leanings and others not. In Tripoli, for example, there are as many as 4 militias in existence. The only effective national-wide institution is the National Oil Corporation, which has slowly built out oil production back up and is the predominant source of that. The problem here is, I think, the intervention of some international regional powers like for instance, Russia, Turkey, and other countries, in the context of creating such a balance of powers there, because what's going to be the real outcomes is remaining struggling between all warriors for a long time. I think even no one can over control the country, and right now there is switching wars and the surrounding Tripoli. Haftar not having a lot of chances to gain, because even he presented himself as a stronger man in the battles, in the whole battles, but actually he cannot succeed to do the same. And the other militias on the other side, the national government of the government of national accord is supported by other side, which is creating such balance, because there is sometimes the balance, it's imbalanced wars or imbalanced special wars, and this is I think the question we raises right now about the United Nations resolution that condemning and not telling frankly to cease fire in Libya.
Dr. Issam, I'm sorry to interrupt you there. We'll have to leave it at that. We've run time. Dr. Issam Laroussi and Mr. Resul, thank you so much for giving us your insight here on the developments in Libya. With that, we'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newswire. We've talked about Syria and the developments in Libya, and now a little closer to home, just in our neighborhood in Afghanistan. A lot has been happening in the past few weeks as the 7th round of talks between Taliban and the US have been going on. But what's important here is also the intra-Afghan talks that took place in Doha. The call from all quarters is mostly hailing the talks as a positive development. There were 17 Taliban members who met with 60 delegates from Kabul in an intra-Afghan dialogue conference on peace, which took place in Doha. It was a 2-day conference. It's just concluded on Sunday night. And the resolution that's come forth is basically saying that we agree to stopping attacks on religious centers, schools, hospitals, education centers, bazaars, water dams and workplaces. This is the words right out of that resolution. But at the same time, Sherif Bastiniksai, the chief negotiator for the Taliban, has come out and said that there will be, as long as there is no troop withdrawal, as long as there is foreign occupation in Afghanistan, the Taliban will not accept the elections and the results of them. So the conversation today is essentially going to be around how we see Afghanistan moving forward from here. To have this conversation, we would like to welcome Ms. Zakia Wardak, who is a political analyst joining us from Kabul. And also we have later on, we'll be joined by another guest. But Ms. Zakia, let's start with you. How do you feel about the outcome of the intra-Afghan peace talks?
Well, actually, before intra-Afghan dialogue seems impossible, but it happened, and it took significant steps forward. And I think it's a time that we all should work together to give an end to this long, unnecessary, and brutal war in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And I'm extremely impressed with the Zalmay Khalilzad's efforts towards peace and his patience and also persistence and towards peace. And the outcome, have you guys seen that? What's the outcome? Was it that there's many people, like 60 delegation went from Afghanistan. Actually, most of them were government employee, but they did not go to represent the government.
They went in a personal capacity. Ms. Zakia, would you say just the fact that the Taliban has agreed to meet such a big delegation and calling it and stipulating that these were meeting, these representatives of the government were actually coming in their personal capacity, in itself, isn't that a big victory, considering the Taliban refused to have anything to do or speak to the government?
Well, actually, well, at this moment, these people who went there, they are not representative. They did not go as a representative of the government, as you said it yourself, that they went for a personal capacity. But we also saw that, that the government doesn't, these days the government doesn't govern properly. The public is not happy with the government, and the environment is very unsafe. And I don't think at this time the Taliban will talk to the government of Afghanistan. They will talk to the Americans, they will talk to the American government, they will talk to the public, but at this moment they are not ready to talk to the Afghan government. Let me add this also, that it's very hard to predict what is going to happen next time, because we don't know if the Taliban change their mind or whatever.
Well, let's not get sorry, Ms. Zakia, I'm going to again interrupt you there, but let's also first, before we go into what could happen in the future, also talk about the resolution itself that was forwarded, where the Afghan leaders basically with the Taliban called to reduce civilian casualties to zero. Do you feel that they will hold up to this end of their deal, considering that while these peace talks have been taking place with the US, in parallel in Afghanistan, violence has gone up?
Well, I believe it's the time for them to start a new beginning and a trust. If there is no trust and honesty among them, with the deal that they want to bring this casualty to the level of the zero, then there will be a start for the new war. And it will take many, many more years to bring the peace. So I believe it's the time to take this opportunity. And also, we should remember that the chain of command anywhere in Afghanistan, even in the government institution, are not followed. We don't know what the ground level of the people will handle the orders, but we have to be careful what information we are spreading. But I believe that they should work hard for that they should bring the casualty to the ground, to the level of zero.
So, Ms. Zakia, are you confident that the Taliban will see the approach that you've also talked about in the past and even now towards women's rights in all spheres of life? The role of women in Afghanistan to be the same as how the Taliban see it in terms of institutionalizing the Islamic system in Afghanistan?
Well, we have a constitution with the Islamic principle and ensuring women's rights. And I believe that today's Taliban are not the Taliban in the 90s. And also that today's women are not the women who were there in the 90s. So the women have the right the right for the basic and advanced learning, financial empowerment, as many women lost all the male in their families due to the war. So yes.
So yes, okay. And also you have written earlier in the Washington Post about a question you posed there, that what kind of a military, what kind of a peace settlement will find such broad acceptance in all parts of Afghanistan, so that there is no military presence needed to maintain stability? I'm going to throw that question back at you. From the peace process that has just concluded with the Afghans and the Taliban, what do you think is going to be that middle ground that they're going to reach?
Well, the peace that will be accepted among us all, it is a peace that is important. It's important. Importantly by us. Like I said it before also, that it must be a dialogue with everyone in the nations. Those who were before part of the Taliban, those who were affected by the Taliban, women, children, elders, the people, that they are begging, every part of the nation, the people have to come sit with it. And once they talk about their grievances, once they talk about their sufferingness, so that time they can come up, come together and bring a potential solution. That time can be a potential solution can be formed.
Okay. There is a concern about the Taliban, who are right now, even though they have stipulated time and again that unless there is troop withdrawal, we're not going to move forward. But if there is troop withdrawal and everything goes as planned, if things are progressing positively, as we've seen with the intra-Afghan talks, is there concerns in the Afghan community about the Taliban not sticking to their side of the bargain?
Well, it is a concern, as I said before. It is a time for a new beginning. A new beginning means that when they are talk with something, they have to deliver it. And that's why, there was a delegation of women over there to present the Afghan women and talk about, the pain and what the suffering a women have in Afghanistan, So that's why when they are, so far I have read and I heard that they said that they will have the women will have the freedom of talk, the women will go to the school, the women will work, but they'll all be according to the Sharia of law, Islamic Sharia. So what they say is, whatever promises they are making, they must deliver it. Otherwise, people will lose their faith and also their trust in them.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Ms. Zakia. Unfortunately, we've run out of time here and we've come to the end of the program here. We will be seeing you tomorrow with a new set of stories exploring the developments around the world. Till then, goodbye.